Okay. So that being said, let's get going. Yep, we're getting going now. This is the office hour for assignment number 2 for healthcare project analysis. And based on that, we're going to talk about a couple of different things because there's a couple of key things that you need to be aware of with the risk and the value, okay? Okay, and I'm not using a headset today because it was not working right. And so if I type, you guys will hear me type, unfortunately. Usually I don't get that. Okay, can everybody else hear? I think so. Let me check and see why you are not hearing. Hang on one second, and I'm getting one person sorted out here, and then we'll get going. So sorry for the key typing. Okay, cool. So everybody should have the assignment for, I'm going to share the assignment for, that you guys should have. Okay, everybody should have this assignment. This is homework number 2. Hopefully it looks familiar to you guys, right? Okay, whoops, hang on. We'll get to that in just a second. We're going to put that one away. Okay, so right now I'm going to, actually let me get rid of PowerPoint here to make sure that we're going to get that. Okay, so here we go. So we've got the assignment here, okay? And first of all, this assignment is a report, okay? So report means pretty much as long as you want it to be, okay? There's not really a maximum number of pages. So you need to do what you need to have to feel that you've got everything done that you need to have, okay? So that being said, let's take a look at what you need to do. So what we're looking to do is you're going to create a value and risk analysis report of one of 2 service scenarios. So when you're thinking about this, right, and you're looking at these, your scenarios here, right, that you might have should sound very familiar to you, right? We've got the emergency department staffing, and we've also got adding a clinic. So with that being said, you can reuse the information that you have from course 3 in this assignment. So if you focused your course 3 homework 5 on emergency department, go ahead and reuse that as part of this assignment, okay? If you looked at the clinic situation, go ahead and look to see what you can reuse, okay? So with that being said, go ahead and choose your department. You only need one of the 2 scenarios. You don't have to do both, okay? So choose either the emergency department / urgent care or look at the outpatient clinic. Okay, so choose one of those 2 to kind of figure out what you're going to do. And in your assignment, the big assignment, as you might gather from the lecture, right, the assignment is really focusing on value and risk. So that being said, your value and risk sections in this paper need to be pretty in-depth, okay? There's an entire lecture on value and an entire lecture on risk. So I am not looking for, you should not have the risk and the value fit onto a single page, okay? That's sort of an option, but you're really not going to get all the points if you fit both of these into a single page, okay? Think about multiple paragraphs. Think about detail. One of the problems that we see a lot of in projects, and one of the reasons that they tend to fail, is that, and you've seen this in the readings, you've seen this, heard this in the lecture, but one of the big things is that people don't do a very good job of explaining how this brings value to different stakeholder groups, right? You've all seen, and I saw in discussion in week 2 discussion, right, that, week 2 discussion, that one of the things that you guys have looked at with this is, or talked about, is the fact that you've all seen these projects that have gotten pushed down the road, right? They've gotten pushed out into, maybe from headquarters, maybe from the VISN, maybe from the medical center. They've gotten pushed out, and nobody in the field has any idea of what's going on or why we should be doing this, or where that value is and what happens to those types of projects. Everybody grumbles, right, about having to do this extra thing because we don't know why we're doing it and we don't see any value in it. After a while, we all kind of pay lip service to it and we'll try it for a while. But sooner or later, what happens to these projects? You go back to doing things the way you were, right? We've all been there. We've all seen those types of projects happening. So one of the things we're learning, or one of the things that I'm trying to teach you guys in this course, is to really do a better job of explaining how these projects, how your project ideas, how any project you're working on really has that value. So show it the value, explain the different kinds of value, show how it brings value in different ways to different groups of people. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is we also do a very good job of thinking about any risks, because we all know that risks aren't fun to think about, right? Let's think about value. That's the hooray, let's get going on this project. But people don't want to think about risk because risk means potential for failure in general, right? Something could go wrong. We don't like thinking about what could go wrong in healthcare. We do it because it's necessary, but we don't think about it. And generally, we don't think about it up front. So what you're going to be doing in the next few weeks in this assignment, and then also going forward, is really focusing on explaining and identifying value, but then also thinking about what might go wrong or what could be a potential risk. Okay? So we're going to talk about these in a little bit. I'm going to talk about, bring up a couple key points from the lecture in just a second. But what I want to talk about in this assignment is these two bullets right here should be a good chunk of your paper. Okay, so which scenario you've chosen and the background around the scenario that you've chosen, right? Those you could probably even pull from course 3's assignment. Okay, you've already picked a scenario. You've already done some reasoning about the background. Why should we do this? Okay, one addition is you're going to need to add what's called a basic working hypothesis. So either think about way back to course 1 when we talked about hypothesis, right? We have the null hypothesis, nothing's going to change. And we also have alternate hypothesis, something is going to change. Or you might have one or two, this is going to change and that's going to change and X, Y, Z is going to change. So that being said, with your basic working hypothesis, what you want to identify in this is, I think if we do this project, either if we keep things the way that they're at, here's what's going to happen. If we do the project and we make some changes, then this could happen. So it's super basic. It doesn't need to be in depth. You don't need to necessarily have the hypothesis. It doesn't need to be a smart statement. Just in general, what do you think is going to happen? What do you anticipate happening? So you're kind of setting the stage, if you will, with this. So you've talked about I'm choosing the urgent care because X, Y, Z. Here's why I think we need to take a look at this. We've had some history around the usage of the urgent care, ups and downs in terms of usage patterns. And so based on this, I think that we should move forward by doing X, Y, Z, and I think this is what's going to happen. Okay, you're not going to have to prove your hypothesis or disprove your hypothesis in this paper. It's just an idea of, okay, here's what I think could happen. Does that make sense to everybody? That you're not really looking at, I'm not looking for you to prove or disprove the hypothesis. I'm looking more for you to kind of think about, okay, where do we go from here? What should we be working on? So again, if you think back to what you did in that case study for course 3, assignment 5, right? You had to think about, where do we go from here? What do we do next, right? That you had to make that recommendation of what type of project to do. So when you're doing that, right? So all of these things you already did in that assignment. So now what you're going to do is you're going to go back and look at that case study. And again, if you did it well, this should be minimal effort to get the data updated and to get some of these pieces put together. So these first 3 bullets you should be able to take out of your assignment from homework, course 3, homework 5. Okay. Now, some new pieces that we're adding in here is what customer groups need to be considered. So who are our customers? So depending on your situation, depending on your scenario, everybody's going to have internal customers and external customers. And the definition of internal and external can kind of change. So internal is usually staff, usually the agency. Let's see, sometimes veterans are internal and sometimes they're external. It really depends on what you're looking at doing, okay? So veterans need to be considered, obviously, because we're the VA, but you need to think about whether or not it's going to be more of an internal or more of an external to the project, okay? So external can also be things like outside service organizations, the community at large, that kind of thing. So when you're looking at the customer groups, think about who your customer groups might be. If you are working on if you're working on a project, let's say you're working on a project that pertains to a specific department at a medical center, the internal customers might be those staff for that particular department, and external might be other staff members at the medical center. Do you see how that works? So customer groups can kind of be fluid. So really think about what's internal to this project or this department or this area that you're working on, and then what would be external. So external could still be staff at a local VA. If it's, for example, like I said in my example, you've got this subgroup, a sub-department. So the operating room staff, for example, in the medical center might be internal, and external might be the staffing on the wards. Because that's somewhere, once you get done in the operating room, you're going to be taking that individual. If it's an inpatient situation, you're going to take them to an inpatient ward, right? Depending on what's going on. Hopefully you're not going to be taking them to the ICU, but depending on the situation, that you can do it. So think about what an internal and external might be. And one thing to kind of keep in mind too is that I tried to design this assignment so that you didn't have to start from scratch. But if you wanted to start from scratch with it and you just wanted to, or if you want to choose a different scenario, totally fine. There is no penalty for doing that. I just was trying to make it a little easier in terms of the amount of time that you've got. And I know everybody, hopefully by now you're much more efficient at data mining than you were when you started course 3. But I also know it's not everybody's most favorite thing, unlike mine. Well, it's not probably my most favorite thing, but I really like data mining, if you guys haven't figured that out yet. So if you decided you wanted to start from scratch and change your scenario, that's totally fine as well. Just make sure you've got these pieces, kind of all the pieces going into it. So customer groups, defining our customer groups a little bit better, that is going to be a little bit, that's going to be a little bit new. We talked about it a little bit in course 3, but not as much as we have here. Or not as much of a focus as we are going to be doing in course 4. Okay, so customer groups. Then the value to those internal groups and the external groups, and we'll get into this in just a second. I'm going to actually switch over to the lecture notes in just a minute, and we'll talk about value, and we'll talk about risk a little bit then as well. So these 2 bullets, totally new. Okay, identification of any gaps in information needed. What information do you need to make this a little bit more robust presentation, make this a little bit more robust report? And if you were going to, what is out there? So some people, you might not have any gaps, and that's okay, just state that. If you have, but most people in the years that I've been teaching these courses, there are some things that maybe you don't have access to right now. Maybe you aren't sure how to do some measurements on something yet. Maybe you'll need to take some data, because you know that there is the data, you just don't maybe have the updated data. Okay, maybe we need to run a small test of change or a small experiment to get our data. So things about that. Maybe you need to get somebody else on board, put your team together. So what are those gaps that might be there? And again, you may not have any. Just state that you don't see any that are there right now. Does that make sense how that works? And what you're going to do is you're going to do a summary of your preliminary analysis. So if you're using the data from course 3, again, go ahead and summarize your preliminary analysis. When you're doing the summary, anytime you're giving specific numbers, again, data source, right? There's a couple of people that missed that in assignment number 1, so data source again. Secondly, with your summary, if you're talking numbers, or especially if you're talking trends, put a graph or a table in there. Okay, it's much easier when you're reviewing a long report and someone's talking about, well, the trend over the last 5 years, we can see that outpatient clinic A seems to be an outlier when it comes to the number of patients that are following a diabetes protocol. That's great, but give me show me a picture. Okay, give me a visual to kind of go along with that, because that really cements it in somebody's head. And again, one of the things we're trying to do with these when we're doing project analysis is you're trying to put together a document that's going to sell this project. Okay, when you're selling something, what do we know? One of the old cliches is a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? That holds true for graphs and tables as well. So you can talk about it, give 1 or 2 sentences, but also put that graph in there so there is that visual reference. So somebody can say, oh yeah, I see exactly what you're talking about. It isn't just that clinic A is 1 or 2 patients out, is outlier by maybe like 1 or 2 or 5 patients, but they're an outlier by 15 to 20 patients. And that looks a little odd when I'm looking at how they're doing compared to everybody else. Okay, I know in some of your papers and in some of the discussions, you guys have talked about the SAIL measures, right? And we're looking at quintiles with that. So when you're talking about that, show how you compare if it's something that comes up in your assignment, or even going forward. Always when you're talking about trends or comparisons, try to give that visual so that the reader can see, or the audience, if you're doing a presentation, can see what you're talking about. You'll have much, much more impact on that. Your words will have that much more weight to them in terms of whether or not you're, quote unquote, believable. Hopefully, if you've got the sources on there, that shouldn't be an issue, but some people always have to do that questioning, right? People play the devil's advocate. They're always asking, well, so I don't really think that's right. Where did you get that? I don't, it's probably only by 1 or 2 people. It's not as bad as you're making it out to be. Well, if we look at the actual data, right, in a graph or a table or a chart, now you can show it and say, well, here's where everybody else is, and look, we're out there. We need to do something. Okay, so after you get all of this stuff done up here, you need to have a conclusion or summary of what are the key findings. So we talked about in the last office hour, right? We talked about when you're doing a presentation, tell people what you're going to tell them. Tell them the information. Give them the information, and then summarize. Tell them what you told them. Okay, which again is kind of a 3-prong attack. But that's one of the things to kind of think about. What you're doing in this as well is we're talking a little about here's the scenario I've chosen. Here's my background. Here's what I think. Here's what I found. And now here's a summary of what are the key findings and kind of what do we do, what do we do about this? Does that make sense? So you're going to do kind of that 3-prong approach again. Tell me what you're going to tell me. Give me all the data to back it up, all the information to back it up, and then give me a summary of what you just told me. Okay, if you follow this format, your reports and any briefings you do are going to become much, much clearer to those people that you send them to or you're presenting to, if you follow kind of that 3-prong attack. So when you're doing it, go ahead and put, like I said, put that summary in there. So do you guys have questions on the report itself? Okay. And I tried in the assignment details under the value and the risk section to give you some questions to kind of as starting points in terms of looking at value and looking at risk, because I realized for the vast majority of you, looking at these 2 things in detail is not second nature. It's not something maybe you've done before, or you might have done it a little bit, but not to this level. Okay, so I tried to give you guys some questions to get you started, to get those creative juices flowing, and kind of go from there. So now what I'd like to take a look at, if nobody's got questions on that, is let's take a little bit of a look at what to pay attention to in those 2 lectures. So let me pop over here. Oh, actually, before we do get into this, I'm going to actually do one other thing. I want to show you one thing really quickly. Okay, so this is your, this should be familiar to everybody. So this is Module 2, and one thing on the course website, and one thing I did want to point out is I did put an example paper for a clinic and an emergency department in the handout section. So in the handout section, here's your assignment paper, and then here's an example. You don't have to use these examples, piece by piece, or make yours exactly like this, but just to give an idea of how you might set some of these things up, especially around the value and the risk analysis parts, because I know, like I said, for a vast majority of you, you guys have not done this before. So I wanted to give some examples, because over the years, I've gotten some questions about how do I set this up? How do I put this together? So this is an example of a clinic, an example of an emergency department. Again, emergency department, you can use urgent care. That's totally fine. But I did want to point out that those are available. Again, so that's in Module 2. You can find those in the handout section. So just wanted to point that out if you haven't looked at those before. Okay, so let's go over here now, and we will look at our assignment. So just a second while I get that, or not the assignment, excuse me. We're going to look at the lecture notes. 1 second. Come on. Okay. It didn't want to let me get the share application option out. Okay, so here we go. Everybody see PowerPoint again? So this is lecture notes for Module 2. So things I want to point out to you, the pieces, I kind of like the key things from this is page 4 here. These are kind of some of your basic perspectives of value, right? You've got environmental. So how does the project, and remember, environmental, it does not necessarily mean, environmental does not necessarily have to only be something where we're talking about the larger environment. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean, are we recycling? Is it going to have an impact on the flowers and the trees? Things like that. Think about environment as surroundings, right? So it's, you know, looking around, it could be the chairs that you're sitting on. It could be where things are located in the, you know, in a clinic. It could be, you know, environment could be, is it really loud? Is it really, you know, is it something that, you know, a place that deadens the sound? What about, is it comfortable for people who are waiting? I know several of you in your discussion boards posts have talked about things like looking at the medication closets in terms of, I know somebody brought up a situation, a project where they didn't think about how big the closet was and only one person could be in it at a time, which then slowed everything else down. I know some people talked about the fact that they ended up having a discharge waiting room that they put together so that people who are discharged could get out there, you know, and kind of, you know, put things together that way. So think about environment that way. What is the if you're a frontline staffer and you're the receptionist, what does your desk space look like? Is it something that you can work in, or is it really small? Do you actually have enough space to do your work? So think about environmental beyond just what we normally think about, which is, you know, the larger environment, climate change, all that bit. So think about environment as a little bit closer in. Economical, hopefully that's pretty, whoopsies. Sorry, didn't mean to make you jump all over. So economical should be pretty self-explanatory, right? Again, this goes into cost savings, and that's a big thing right now, looking at costs in terms of how can we maximize our funding in terms of looking at, you know, what services we can offer. So economical. Societal. Okay, so think about society, like how does societal in terms of, we've talked in the past about, and many of you are know this as well, is a lot of times veterans like using the VA because when they come and they're waiting in the waiting room, there are people who have similar experiences. So they're going to have a different approach to who they're working with. We've also talked about looking at, you know, with the choice program and sending veterans out, so care in the community. Sometimes there are issues with the community providers not necessarily understanding how to treat certain things to the same level and with the same background that the VA staff has. Okay, so think about societal. Also, we've got the perception issue, right? That's been something that you guys are constantly in the news for, you know, unfortunately, more in the news for things that you know, one or two things that didn't go right, as opposed to all the things on a daily basis that you guys do well. So that's something that I don't think, you know, there's the positive versus negative press situation. Okay, so think about, you know, these three perspectives of value and how, again, they could bring value to our three groups. So anytime you're talking about value, you need to think about those three main stakeholder groups: our veteran, our staff, and our agency. Okay, so that has to come into any discussion of value, any discussion of risk. You need to have those three groups present. So this is page 4 in your lecture notes. The other thing I wanted to talk about is page 6. And these are your major types of value. So in the assignment over here, when I'm talking about identification of value the project could bring, this is those perspectives of value, and these major types of value are what I am looking for. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. You've got 6 of them here: reaction and perceived, learning and confidence, application implementation, impact and consequence, ROI, return on investment, and intangible. Now, when you guys looked at this, I'm hoping that everybody said, hey, this looks really familiar. Didn't we already see these before? Because these are very, very similar. If you think about it, these 4 should, whoops, I don't know why I'm jumping around today. Sorry, my mouse hand is apparently a little jittery. Maybe there's too much coffee this morning. Anyway, so these first 4, right, look at, sound, and should seem very similar to your objectives, right? We've got those 4 objectives that we talked about in assignment number 1, those 4 types of objectives. They should match up very, very well with these first 4 bullets of value. Also, when we are talking about opportunities in assignment number 1, we are talking about the business needs, right? So we're looking at investment, we're looking at intangible, things that are tangible, things that are intangible, okay? So your values should track right along with your objectives and your business needs. So looking at the opportunities and looking at your objectives or your goals for your project, you should be able to tie those into your types of value. And there's a reason for that, because if you can show how this objective brings value to each of my 3 groups, or if you can't, sometimes you may not have all 3 groups might not have learning and confidence, or all 3 groups might not have return on investment. But you need to have every single one of those stakeholder groups needs to have at least one of these values assigned to it. Okay? Most of the time, you will have all 3. But you may not have, in some instances, depending on the situation, you may not have the application and implementation, for example. If you're looking at opening a clinic, you might not have all 3 of them for some of your application and implementation values. Okay, your ROI may or may not apply to everybody, to all 3 of those groups. But you want to try to have all 3 groups for all of these, if you can. That's kind of like your perfect scenario, if that makes sense, that you can tie all 3 groups to each one of these 6. So you'd end up with then potentially 18 value statements. You can definitely have more than that, but as a minimum, you might have 18. Or excuse me, it's not even as a minimum. In an ideal scenario, you'd have at least a minimum of 18. In the real world, it's probably going to be less, give or take, just because, like I said, if you're opening a clinic, the implementation might not be so much of a value for the actual implementation of opening the clinic, the steps that need to happen to open the clinic. That's maybe not going to have so much value to either the staff or the veteran, but it'll have value to the agency, for example. Learning and confidence is probably going to be more veteran and staff and not as much agency. Does that make sense how that kind of works? So think about how these go. My personal way of looking at all of these is I like to make a table, which shouldn't surprise you, any of you by now. I like to make a table and just kind of have, my stakeholder groups across the top and then my values down the side, or vice versa, and then just kind of fill in my boxes and say, okay, under veteran, for this particular project, what would be a reaction and perceived value? What kind of statement could I make around that? Okay, let's go over here. What about staff? Okay, what can I say about that? What about agency? What's going to be the reaction and perceived value there? What about the external, my external customers? What are they going to see? So as you go through this, like I said, I personally like to make a table. You do not have to make a table. Some people like doing it in paragraphs, so they have one paragraph for each of the types of value. That is totally up to you. Okay, so do what makes makes more sense for your way of thinking with this, and just kind of go from there. So the perspective, these 3 major ones: environmental, economic, and societal, and then that's page 4 and page 6. Is these are kind of your category headings, if you will, page 4 and page 6. Now, if you're having trouble coming up with values, because I realize, again, most of you have not thought about value at this level of detail before. If you're having trouble coming up with what might be a value, you can use page 7 in your lecture notes to help you think about what these might be. Okay, so if you're looking at reaction and perceived value, is there going to be an increased perception of safety from the veteran's point of view? What about from the staff point of view? What about from the agency point of view? Okay, so if there's going to be an increased perception of safety, and you can come up with a statement about that, okay, that safety one now you can pop right into here, into reaction and perceived value. You see how that works? So think about these page 7 as kind of your jumping off points, your thought starters as to if you're having trouble coming up with values, here are some ideas on what you might think about to get you started thinking of, get you started in terms of putting those values together. Does that make sense? how this kind of how these kind of lead into each other here? Okay, so these are kind of, like I said, this is kind of the key piece, the kind of the things I want you guys to really pay attention to when you're talking about this. And you can kind of see as you're going into these details and you're putting these statements together, why I said this section, the value section, I said this in my weekly email that I sent out yesterday to the class, why this section needs to be pretty in-depth. If it's a half a page long, you are probably not going to get all the points because it will not be detailed enough. Okay, so this is why these two sections, the value, and we'll talk about risk here in just a minute. That is why these two sections really, I called that out as those really need to be detailed, because this is something, this is kind of, if you think about it, this is the meat of this project. Because you can show all the data you want, right? But what does it come down to? Everybody wants to know, well, what's in it for me? We talked about this in the last office hour. It's kind of a blunt way to think about it, but the background is kind of the so what? Why should we think about this? Why should we pay attention to it? Your preliminary analysis kind of leads into that, like here's the data that says we need to pay attention to this. But then you also want to, in any project, everybody is thinking, whenever you're presenting a project, whenever you're on a project team, you're starting a project, you're implementing the project, no matter where you are in the project, timeline, everybody, whether or not they voice it, everybody is thinking in their head, well, what's in it for me, right? Anybody who's dealing with the implementation as you're implementing a project, the staff that is going to be, continuing the project on after you're done, they're thinking, what's in it for me, okay? And that's where these types of value really come into play. If you've thought about this ahead of time, now you've got something when somebody says, well, what's in it for me? Maybe not quite like that, but in a similar thing, well, why do we, how is this going to really benefit my department? You can point to something and say, well, we're looking at here's how it's going to bring a perceived value of increased safety. When you complete the training that we've got for this, you're going to be able to be more efficient and effective in terms of the care that you're providing. And we're going to be more equitable, because if we've got our coding right, then we know we're going to be getting you will have adequate funds to be able to provide the services and the care that you want to be able to provide to your patients. So that's where this really comes in. Now, I know several of you have already have been through the Lean Six Sigma training, and think about this as an expansion of kind of what Lean Six Sigma puts together. So Lean Six Sigma does a really, really good job of once you've got the project approved and you're working on, what are solutions, what do we need to be looking at, where's the problem, where's the solution, how do we implement it, all of that kind of things. So think about this as complementing your Lean Six Sigma training. So this is going to go more into depth around what's in it for me and kind of the front end of putting a project together. And then Lean Six Sigma really takes off once the project's been started, once the project's been approved, we're going to go forward with it. And now we're going to really focus on kind of the application and implementation and the impact as well. We also do a lot of ROI with that. But think about this is kind of the precursor to getting your project going. So when you're analyzing a project proposal, even if it's in a Six Sigma format, right, you'll still be able to work through these types of pieces and say, okay, well, is it showing value would this project bring value to our three major stakeholder groups? Okay, and does it have any external value? What kind of value can it bring to the table? Okay, have we considered this? Have we looked at this? Okay, so think about this again as kind of complementing any Lean Six Sigma training that you've done up to this point. Okay, so any questions on value at all? Okay. Okay, so there's if you guys are confused a little bit about kind of how these work in terms of a table for each, so think about this first one. And this is where, if you haven't looked at the examples, I definitely recommend going out and looking at the examples on the course website, because that should help kind of, put these things together. But when you're looking at the groupings, think about doing think about this as kind of like your three larger umbrellas. Okay, so we always need to be concerned about the environment. We always need, again, thinking about environment and that, in a slightly different way than, flowers and trees and grass. And water and things like that, but even, more with even, environment within the immediate environment. Okay, think about economics and think about society. So these are kind of like your larger groupings. Then when you get down to this one, I personally, so a lot of times you might have these in like paragraphs. Some people like to put them in a table. Some people like to put them in just kind of a paragraph form. So I would do these, kind of think about these from a broader sense. And then this is going to be kind of your focus. So you're going to kind of zoom in on these 6 here. Okay, and again, I like to have a table for these. I've had students in the past that do a paragraph for each of them. Totally fine. But then this list here is going to be your major types of value. The third list, this on page 7, the one that comes right after, think about these as these are things that you could use to make the statements of value that fit into this. So if you have like learning and confidence, for example, we might say that we're going to do training on coding, because I know several people had brought that up in past discussions, both in course 3 and also in the first couple of weeks of course 4. So we have coding error. We want to make sure that we've got that our everybody who's doing coding understands the importance of coding. So we're going to have but we need to explain how does that show value to the staff. Well, what we're going to do is a value for the staff is if you take the training that that is provided, that we're going to provide on coding, even if it's a refresher for you, it's going to allow you to be more efficient with your coding because you know exactly what to do when. It'll also help you be a little bit more timely in terms of getting those encounters closed out within our time frame. And additionally, it's going to ultimately prove more equitable for everybody as a whole because of the fact that we have these, if we have the correct coding, we're going to get our patients into the correct funding group, which means that you will then, the larger clinic and therefore our staff will have a little bit better pool of money to work with, more appropriate to the care that we provide, which is going to allow us to provide the best care that we can to our patients. Does that make sense, or did that make things more confusing? So that would be a kind of a long roundabout way of saying that that would be a value to staff for learning and confidence. If we go through the training that is provided as part of this project, you're going to be able to be more efficient at your coding, which means you'll be able to get your encounters closed out in a more timely fashion. And then also that's going to provide a better pot of money in terms of the larger funding when we look at VERA, so that we can provide the services that we want to be able to provide to our staff, to our patients, to our veterans. So like I said, that's kind of wordy. I'd probably if I typed all that out, I'd probably kind of trim it down a little bit. So it isn't quite as verbose, but that's a way that you might have you can use this list on page 7 to help you kind of frame what these values are, because sometimes it's hard to come up with a value for each of these 6 things for the different stakeholder groups. I will totally admit it. It is hard. It takes time. This is probably what's going to take you the most time, is this and your risk. And it should, because it's something that you really need to think about. And again, if you're not practiced at thinking about value in this level of detail, it takes time. As you go on, it's going to start clicking, and it'll make a lot more sense, and you'll be a lot faster at kind of coming up with these. So, but if the first few times through it, it takes a while. So that's why I kind of put this list together, so that you've got some ideas on what could we talk about in terms of, what you're going to have. And you're not going to have all 9 of these in each one of your types of value. But think about your types of value. Again, these match up to your objectives, and they match up to our needs from lecture 1. And so think about now, how can I explain how you're going to have, how any learning that's going to take place is going to show value for our veterans, and show value for our staff, and show value for the agency. If we go with my scenario of coding, right, it's going to be from the veteran perspective, if you're more efficient and you're more timely with getting the coding done, and also making sure that we're going to get the equitable amount of funding that makes sense, I'm going to have a better experience as a veteran because I'm going to be able to get the services that I need. So it's really coming down to, you're really focusing on everything being patient-centered. which means my satisfaction is going to go up. From the agency perspective, I've got better reliability in terms of knowing that the coding is correct, which means that the division of cost or the division of funding is going to be more equitable. Does that make sense? So you can really use all these different keywords here as kind of like jumping off points for framing them. There are more things than just these 9, but I kind of wanted to give you guys somewhere to kind of go to if you get a little bit stuck. So generally speaking, I would say you want to kind of go to Wes's question here. I would say kind of discuss the 3 like bigger umbrellas first. So these 3, the environmental, economical, and societal, kind of think about these as like broad strokes. So you've got your 3 like big umbrellas here. Can you see? I can totally tell you guys can see me drawing my umbrellas, right? 1, 2, 3. And then go into more detail with your major types of values. So I usually say, you know, do like a couple of paragraphs on these 3. And again, some people like to split it into a paragraph for each of them, or like a table. You can do a table if you want, totally up to you, or bullets. Some people like to do bullet lists with these. So do one grouping of this. So have a short discussion of these 3, and then go into your kind of major 6 groups here. Does that help answer that question, Wes? In terms of getting kind of how to discuss it. You can discuss them all together, but I found that for me, then my thinking gets muddled. So I like to kind of keep them these 3 and then do the 6. And then, like I said, this extra page down here, page 7, think about using those as kind of your, like, okay, well, I'm not really sure what's, you know, I don't really know how this is going to be a value for a veteran. So I'm going to go look at my word list here and see, can I make any of these words, can any of these words help me show value to the veteran for whatever my project is? Does that make sense? So yeah, so I usually like to do these 3 kind of broader strokes ones first, because then it gets people kind of thinking about, okay, well, you know, yeah, we got to look at, you know, what's going on with our environment. Maybe the parking is really too crowded, or you have to wait too long for the valet, and that means I have to take more time off of work and all these different things. And then kind of go into the detailed ones here, because then this kind of starts narrowing it down in the future when you tie the values to your objectives and to your business needs. Now that's going to really kind of come all together. And we're not going to do that in this particular assignment. Going forward after the first of the year, we'll have an assignment where we kind of pull those 2 things together. But right now, think about, you know, like how you can work on getting those values put together. Okay. So good. We've got about 15 minutes left for risk, so I'm going to try to get everything in here. So this is module 3. This is risk. When you're thinking about risk, okay, there's 2 kind of major components here. There's risk within the person, okay? So in healthcare, right, this should all look familiar to you. We talked about this. We've talked about this with our data analysis, our data mining in the last course, right? We looked at age, we looked at gender, we looked at diagnosis, you know, all kinds of stuff. We talked about quality of life. We talked about, we talked about some of the epidemiological measures, things like that. So all of this is kind of within the person. So again, risks within the person. You know, we know that certain genders are more predisposed to certain types of illnesses. You know, again, with age, you know, we know that when you hit a certain age bracket, you're more likely to have cataracts than when you're, you know, say elementary school age, right? That plays into it. You know, we know that, there's, from a race and ethnicity standpoint, there are certain ethnic backgrounds that are going to be more predisposed to certain types of, certain types of illnesses. One of the classic ones, right, is sickle cell anemia. We know that certain ethnic backgrounds are more prone to having sickle cell anemia than other ones, okay? Also, in terms of looking at our functionality, right? Again, functionality kind of comes into play in terms of, what era did you serve in, right? Because these functionalities, those different things, the functionality can, and when you're looking at our physical, our psychological, cognitive, psychosocial things, right? That all goes into the type of injuries that we might see depending on the era somebody served, because we know that as medical treatment has gotten better in the field, right, we're seeing a lot of different types of injuries than we did see, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Okay, and one of the reasons, I try to put all of these, and you may have noticed throughout like all 4 courses, right? I did try to give you guys the lecture notes so that you don't have to try to remember everything, because I will also admit, as I grow older, there are a lot of things that I need memory joggers for. Thanks, right? We all, sooner or later, then that kind of goes with age, right? That kind of goes with age and our cognitive over here. To kind of go with Mike's comment, right? So age and cognitive. So sometimes we see, things that are going to be kind of cross-matched. So there are characteristics within the person in terms of risk. Now, you may not know all of these, and depending on the type of project, you may not have a whole lot of these in play. And that's totally fine. I did want to put them out there, though, so you guys are, so everybody, well, guys and gals, so everybody's aware of them. Okay, now if you go to the next page, page 4 in the lecture notes, this is what you're going to probably be using most of the time, is this list here. Generally speaking, when you're looking at risk for a project, you want to identify any risk, any potential risk. We don't know, and it's potential meaning it may be a risk, it may not be a risk. At this point in the project, we don't know. Okay, but it shows that you have thought about this already. Most of the time, most projects that get put forth, we don't think about the risks until we're already doing the project. But you can brainstorm what might be some risks. So when you're looking at this list, what I would recommend that you really kind of look at, and where you start, is put together look at the 5 main, kind of my 5 yellow bullets. So we've got process, marketing, financial, personnel, and administrative and miscellaneous risks. So look at each of these 5 groups and think about what might be risks around process. Okay, and when you're thinking about risk, it's important to look at both the risk of what if we do the project and what if we don't do the project. Okay, so if we look at, let's say, our emergency department staffing, our process, we're going to look at emergency department staffing, and our project is to maybe reduce the hours of the emergency department because our data is showing that we're just not using it. So a risk of reducing the hours of the emergency department might be that in terms of time or in terms of safety, we might not, some of the veterans may not have to travel farther during certain times of the night or certain times of the day and to get to emergency services, and that might pose a safety issue. Okay, so we need to look at value, but we also need to look at risk. From a marketing standpoint, one risk in marketing to reducing the hours of the emergency department might be that a marketing risk might be that we kind of lose stature in the community because now we're downgrading from having an emergency room available all the 24/7 to having emergency room available during evening hours maybe, and then urgent care during the daytime. And I don't even know if that's possible, but I'm just kind of coming up with a scenario. So that might be, that might be perceived from a marketing standpoint as we don't care about our veterans now. That's a risk, right? The value might be that we're maximizing the use of the staff and they're able to work to the top of their licensure because we don't have emergency service. We don't need emergency services all the time. Most of the time, we just need an urgent care. Okay, so we can find somewhere else for people to put them, for those individuals to go, so that would be a value from a staff standpoint, but a risk might be that we're being perceived now as, from a marketing standpoint, as we don't care about our veterans because we're reducing or closing the emergency department. Okay, what risk might there be financially? Well, maybe, I don't know if this is possible, but maybe if we reduce the hours and somebody has to go elsewhere, we're going to have to pay, now we have to pay more for care in the community because we're not open. So when we look at our return on investment, we might decrease the amount of staff costs that we have, but we may end up paying out more in care in the community. So that could be a risk. Looking at, again, so what you want to try to do with these is use these 5 yellow bullets, again, that process, the marketing, financial, personnel, and administrative. And the way that, again, I like to do it personally, and you don't have to do this way, but I like to kind of have a paragraph for each of these. And that way, it's just easy for me to separate in my own head. and I'd have one paragraph for process, one for marketing, one for personnel. Whoopsies, undo that. One for personnel, et cetera. And then these, the blue bullets are things to think about that might be risk. And again, think about what if we change it? What if we don't? So if we don't change it and we leave the emergency department hours as they are, a financial risk might be that we're paying all this money to maintain the level of an emergency department, so appropriate staffing, equipment, etc. And we don't have any patients. Our numbers are decreasing. So from a financial standpoint, we're essentially, quote unquote, wasting money, right? Because we've got people sitting there ready to go, but I can show you that over the last, 6 months, nobody's come in between the hours of, 10 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. So we've got, all morning, or 8 a.m. to noon, we have one person come in. So we've got a financial risk there. So does that make sense how those risks kind of play into things? So like I said, that previous page 3 here, the person characteristics may or may not come into your every project that you've got, but these general characteristics definitely will be a part of every project that you're working on, these main yellow bullet ones. So that's something to think about. We've got just about 5 minutes left. Do you guys have questions on risk? And so again, that's where, when you're looking at this, these two pieces of the assignment, the value and the risk are kind of again, should be a big chunk of this report, because it's something that's really important and something we don't think enough about. Now, I did get one question in email about, let me go back up here, about do we have to have Monte Carlo in there in our paper? And you do not have to have a Monte Carlo example in your paper or recommend that you use it, but Monte Carlo is really looking at determining risk, and this was the best place to put it in without having to have a separate lecture on it. So I wanted to give you guys an example and how you could walk through and do Monte Carlo in your own, on your own. You may or may not, it may or may not be something that you recommend doing, but I at least wanted to get it in there so that you're familiar with what it is and how to use it. Okay, so you do not, even though it's in the lecture, I'm not expecting that everybody run a Monte Carlo example, run a scenario through for your paper. Okay, so but like I said, it fits the best in this lecture because of what it is and what it does. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you guys have any questions on risk? Do you have any questions on value at all? Yes. Okay. So Wes has a really good question. Great question, Wes. So he wants to know if the risks are potential risks if the project were to be done, not the risks that are the reason for proposing the project. Yes. So the risks there. So let's go over here for clarification. We're going to look at two things here at the same time. So the risks that are the reason for proposing the project should be up here in your background around why are we looking at this project? Does that make sense? So the risks around what's going on that we need to do this project, why do we need to do this project? Because there's a risk, whatever the risks are there, that goes in your background. This risk that we're talking about here with the general characteristics and these pieces are if we're going to, the potential risks for completing the project. Okay, and also think about what if we didn't do that project. So if you've done your due diligence and you put your risks about why do we need to do the project up here in your background, and then you're talking about these specific types of risk here around if we do this project, there are some risks. You can also bring that full circle and refer to, as we talked about in the beginning, if we don't do the project, here are some risks that we're going to have around, these risks are going to continue. Does that make sense? Did that explain? Did that help us? Or did I just make you more confused? Because it's hard sometimes since I can't see people's faces as to whether or not it makes sense or if it's made it more confusing. So okay, yeah. So the risks around why are you doing the project? Why should we do why are you proposing the project? Those risks go up here in the background, in the second bullet kind of area. And then the risks to completing the project. What if we do this project? What are risks we want to have? That comes down here in kind of the value and risk section. Okay, so hopefully that cleared it up. So I've got, according to my clock here, we've got 3 more minutes. Do you guys have any last questions around things? Does this help, hopefully? And again, if you have, if you're not, I am recording this, so I'm going to hopefully get it posted up this afternoon, assuming my tech admin can get it posted up for me. And then the secondary piece of this is there are those 2 examples on the course website that I put up, so that hopefully that can kind of help you guys out a little bit, if that will. So, if you, and again, as always, if you have questions as you're writing your paper up and you're not really sure about like where to go or how to set something up, definitely send me an email and let me know, ask the question, because I do try to get everything, as I've said before, my ultimate goal for all of these classes is to have everybody pass with a good understanding of the materials. So if there's something you don't understand, please let me know. Also, if for some reason you can't read my handwriting on feedback for assignment number 1, also please let me know. What other service announcements do we have? Oh, there is also going to be an office hour next week, because our assignment for assignment number 3 is only 1 week long. It's kind of a fun assignment. At least I thought it was fun. And I've had good feedback from previous students that they also have thought it was pretty entertaining. So there is going to be another office hour next week, Thursday. Usually we have them every other week, but this time we are going to have one next week, because I want to get that in before your assignment is due, before the winter break. So you will have no assignment at all, no work due over the winter break. So hopefully everybody will be cheering about that. You get 2 weeks off for the college winter break. So we will also have, like I said, we will have that assignment. We will have that assignment next week, we'll have a new assignment next week, and we will also have an office hours next week. There we go. That's kind of a tongue twister. So with that, let me know, like I said, if there is, if you guys have any other questions on anything, you can always send an email. And I don't see any last minute questions on the assignment or on the lectures or anything like that. So with that, thanks everybody. Good questions today. If you think of anything else, send me an email. If you don't understand my handwriting, also send me an email and ask, and I will chat with you guys next week. So thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your day.